Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. We're delighted to welcome you to this evening for this very special lecture by Michael O'Flaherty, Commissioner for Human Rights, Council of Europe. This talk is presented in tandem with La Grande Illusion, an exhibition of work by Brian Maguire, an exhibition that so impressively reveals how the artist has represented the fragility of human rights and how he has persistently responded to societal injustices and their legacies. Michael O'Flaherty was elected by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in January 2024. He is the 5th Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe. As an Irish human rights lawyer, O'Flaherty has served as Director of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency 2015 to 2023, as a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee 2004 to 2012, as Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commissioner 2011 to 2013, and in various posts at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, notably in setting up operations in conflict-affected countries such as Sierra Leone and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Throughout his decades-long commitment to human rights, he has made significant contributions to their promotion and protection, including through the publication of books and articles and through teaching at various universities. I'm also delighted to say that after this evening's lecture, we'll have a panel discussion with Barbara Dawson, Michael Dempsey and Brian Maguire as well. So to conclude, I would just like to say how honoured we are to have Michael O'Flaherty deliver his talk on the artist as defender of human rights. And please join me in extending a very warm welcome to this distinguished guest. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you very much indeed. Good evening. Such a pleasure to be here. I'm looking with envy at those of you clutching glasses of wine. I would also have to say that if I had known that the great Brian Maguire was going to be here, I would never have accepted the invitation. But it's a really great pleasure, and thank you. Friends, when I was a child of 8 or 9 years old, I was taken by my aunt, my Auntie Kathleen, to the National Gallery here in Dublin. As we walked around the rooms, I asked one of the guards, "What's the most important picture in this gallery?" I was a strange child. And without a moment of hesitation, the guard took me to the doorway and he pointed to the next room and he said, "That's it." And I went over. That painting was the marvelous little piece by Fra Angelico that many of you will know, depicting the attempted martyrdom of Saints Cosmas and Damian. It's very small, way smaller than this, 37 by 46 centimeters. But it's a remarkable painting. In the first place, it's very beautiful. But on examination, it's also very complex, dealing with layer on layer of storytelling. It's highly dramatic, as you can see in the image, and it's unforgettable. In fact, for me, as that strange little boy, and on reminiscence, I recall that it was thrilling and unforgettable. And that was my first experience of great art. My most recent experience of spending a concentrated amount of time in front of a piece of art was just recently confronted by Brian Maguire's Maragualand, forgive me if I don't pronounce it correctly, painted in 2023. It's a considerably larger painting than the Fra Angelico, but it's equally beautiful. And as you can see again from the image, it's highly dramatic, deeply ambiguous. It tells multiple stories all at once, depicting natural beauty, but also its destruction by humankind. But I would suggest that ultimately, this piece of art is hopeful. It indicates regeneration. That's what I think I see in the foliage. And I even see a symbol of hope, a soaring bird. At least I choose to see a soaring bird in the top right-hand corner. Now, these two works are separated in my life by over 50 years, and in history, one from the other by 600 years. But they have in common a search for the truth, a recognition that truth is complex, but that it must be sought. The story must then be told, and it must be told well. in a way that renders it capable of reaching our hearts as well as our minds. And both paintings, I think, have that quality of the ultimate vindication of hope. Now, whether or not hope is ubiquitous in great art is a matter of some debate, but I find it commonly present in the very finest pieces. And there's one quality invariably to be found in great artists, and that is courage. It takes guts to tell the truth. Look at this work by Lilian Tomasco. Here we see what I consider astonishing weaves of color. They stand, according to the artist herself, as proxies for emotion. And that as these proxies, they burrow deep. They bring us deep into the heart of the inner being, into the truth of what it is to be human. This work and others like it are extraordinarily intimate, deeply self-revelatory for good and for ill. And I think its depiction requires great strength, great courage. It's taking account of these qualities inherent in so much great art and great artists, the qualities of truth seeker, truth teller, guardian of hope, person of courage. It is taking account of these that it comes as no surprise that artists through history have been preoccupied with upholding, respecting, demanding respect for human dignity. And this profound humanism is rampant across all art, all disciplines, all schools, all centuries. That is how, in Western art, Christ is so often depicted. Look at almost anything painted by Caravaggio. Moving to other disciplines, there's the music of Benjamin Britten, the writings of Dostoevsky. But coming back to the visual arts and right up to the past century, look most obviously at Picasso's Guernica. These days, it's almost banal to use this work as an illustration of anti-war art, but it's no less a fact for that. What's more, this painting continues to challenge on a daily basis. A version of Guernica hangs outside the UN Security Council room in New York, where I once worked. And I saw with my own eyes how day in, day out, as each diplomat had no choice but to pass that tapestry, they were recalled into a reminder of why they were there, working for peace. Now, the championing of human dignity on the part of artists intensified in the 20th century. This intensification was in parallel with efforts to map out the requirements for the honoring of human dignity in the form of codes of human rights. The development of the modern human rights vocabulary picked up considerable speed during the Second World War. And in fact, a noteworthy moment was a speech by President Roosevelt identifying what he called the 4 freedoms: freedom from want, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear. And out of this wartime and ever-intensifying debate, there eventually was the moment in 1948 of the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, following a drafting exercise, a global exercise, led by Eleanor Roosevelt. Still to today, the Universal Declaration carries within it the great core ideas of the modern-day human rights system. And I should say, the Universal Declaration is emblazoned on the walls in one of the rooms down here in the exhibition. But what is in the Declaration? In the first place, it addresses all aspects of human well-being. It's for sure about what we call civil and political rights, things like the right to vote, right to a fair trial, freedom of assembly, association, expression, but also no less important entitlements to the basics for dignified living, like access to food, to shelter, to healthcare, to the opportunity of having a job. The Universal Declaration also identifies the responsibility of all of us to respect each other's rights. The rights, of course, in the Declaration came to be developed further and in greater detail as binding international treaties at the level of the United Nations, and then here in Europe, in the work of the Council of Europe, and indeed across the regions of the world. One central aspect of the human rights system, as contained in the Universal Declaration and those treaties that followed, is that it is unique. It is universally agreed time and time again. All states, no matter how abusive of human rights they actually are, have acknowledged that the Universal Declaration applies everywhere at all times. This global or universal quality of buy-in to the Declaration is a key element that gives it its force and its power. And it's also why we have to constantly remind that there is no alternative to human rights as a shared vocabulary to honor human dignity. There is no other universally agreed roadmap. Or let's put it like this, there is no plan B. One final aspect of human rights to consider is that it binds states at everything from the central government to the level of the village. Now here's a moving depiction of that reality of the binding at the village level, and it's in the form of a cast of, I beg your pardon, it's not. There it is. It's in the form of a cast of the shoes of Eleanor Roosevelt, together with a very famous quote of hers. I don't know if you can make it out, but within that quote are the words, "Where do human rights begin? In small places, close to home." This piece I'm presenting tonight because it's an example of the remarkable extent to which art practitioners have directly and have specifically engaged the modern human rights system in their own production. I'm also choosing this piece because I had the strange experience of sharing a small office with this piece of art for 6 months. And I'm terribly afraid to say that my predecessors, and I suspect my successors, used to use it to keep the door open. Now, that lovely sculpture of Eleanor Roosevelt's tiny shoes is an early direct representation explicitly of modern day human rights. But probably the first instance of this recognition is in the very famous 4 paintings of Norman Rockwell, The Four Freedoms. Here we have his characterization of freedom of speech. You will also see human rights explicitly represented in the art collections of the great global and regional organizations. My own current organization, the Council of Europe, houses a good collection built up over decades. And it includes, for instance, 2 Spanish artworks which actually carried the simple title, Human Rights. There's the group sculpture located on the lawns outside the Palais de l'Europe by Mariano González Beltrán, and a piece within that palace by Antoni Tapís, again simply titled Human Rights. Ireland has given an artwork to the Council of Europe. It's Patrick Scott's Ray of Sunshine on a Wave. It's a beautiful tapestry. And I believe, notwithstanding its title, that it has a strong human rights resonance. This piece suggests to me the human fingerprint, the unique human right fingerprint, overlaying a dazzling galaxy of rainbow-like colors. And these speak to me in a sense of the unique human individual within the world, acknowledged in all of the dimensions of that identity. Now, the engagement of the arts with human rights extends well beyond the visual arts. Think, for instance, of this work of Seamus Heaney, his great poem, Republic of Conscience, which was commissioned by and specifically written in the context of the work of Amnesty International. Think also of groups of artistic practitioners who have deliberately come together around the context and the frame of human rights in order to do their job in a different way, in a better way, in service of humanity. And one group that I know well is called Musicians for Human Rights, which plays a very useful role in promoting human rights, not only through their music, but also through the direct engagement of the musicians with marginalized communities. Now, friends, interesting work has been carried out in recent years in assessing and better understanding the engagement of the world of arts with the world of human rights, to categorize it, to identify its diverse forms and shapes. This, for instance, was the subject of a conference that I organized in Vienna when I led the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. It was also the subject of a summer school that I organized at NUI Galway in 2015. The exercise has been done, of course, in many other institutions across the world. But drawing from all of this work and fully aware of the risk of reductionism, let me suggest 6 contexts in which the artist and human rights engage. And of course, this cannot be an exhaustive list. And I also acknowledge that a piece of artistic expression will often address more than one of the contexts. And as I illustrate these, I can, in almost every instance, reference the work of Brian Maguire. First, there is the role of the artist in honoring the human, in describing the human imbued with dignity, inviolable, because that is the human at the heart of the human rights system. This, I believe, is very well exemplified by a number of pieces here in the exhibition, but also by this piece entitled Rosie. He painted one of the missing and murdered indigenous people in the Americas, based on a photograph chosen by their family. And I think you'll agree with me that it is a deeply respectful portrait of this young woman. It is in full honor and respect for her identity, notwithstanding the tragedy behind her story. Another example of this genre, if I can call it that, is Gamin by Augusta Savage, already executed back in 1929. This piece was considered very unusual when first produced because it used the art form of the monumental bust to capture the likeness of a poor African-American child living in poverty in Harlem, New York. Now, moving on to the second function, and by far the best known and the most illustrated, that is the role of the artist in recording reality. Again, this is a dimension so magnificently addressed in Aleppo 4. The painting vividly captures the horror of war without a trace, I believe, of sentimentality or propaganda. In its painterliness, in its beauty, it tells a story that 1,000 photographs could never convey. I would suggest this painting is unforgettable. Another artist who has played a very important role in conveying reality, in reporting in a way that is so much more powerful than the non-artistic forms of expression, is Botero. His paintings of the atrocities perpetrated in Abu Ghraib prison are astonishing. I saw them first in an exhibition in Rome, and I immediately sensed how much more effective they were in depicting the horror than had been those pictures taken on a phone, which had triggered and exposed the shameful behavior in the prison. But let's not forget, as I said earlier, that the artist has long recorded the horrors of war. Goya was heavily invested in this task over 200 years ago. But moving on to the third of these contexts, there is the role of the artist in the memorialization of human rights stories, human rights tragedies, the tragedies of the human being. Again, here, in one of the most powerful, I would argue, one of the most powerful and unforgettable paintings in this exhibition, right there, there's "Over Our Heads, the Hollow Seas Closed Up." I can barely find the words to acknowledge the strength of this work as a show of deep respect and honor, not just to one anonymous victim, but to all those who drown so senselessly in our seas. I also have to say that I have to acknowledge the ironic positioning of another tiny little piece beside that great painting. It's called The Palace of the People, but it's a painting of the European Commission headquarters in Brussels, the Berlaymont. And I'll let you draw the conclusions, whichever ones the curators intended us to draw. See if they're the same. For a different form of memorialization, have a look at this piece by Louise Bourgeois, for the victims of witch trials in Norway that had led to the execution of 91 people, mostly women. A fourth dimension of the work that artists often choose to engage is the expression of outrage, expression of anger at the degree at what we will tolerate in our world, what people will allow to happen. This is already evident in some of the work we've already looked at this evening. But have a look also at another work by Brian Maguire, Arizona 1. I would suggest that this is so clearly a work of fury and outrage, and it's certainly not meant to be easy to look at. And then, to move on to another area of the art, still in this context of outrage, pay attention to the great book by Stéphane Hessel, Indignez-vous. It's a tiny little book. It's really hardly more than a booklet produced just before he died. And it's his cry of outrage, but this time at the extent to which we are squandering our human rights inheritance so carelessly, so dangerously. A fifth dimension of the role of the arts in supporting human rights and engaging with human rights is in the form of celebration of identity, celebration of diversity, celebration of culture. Now, I'm spending all of this week traveling around Ireland, meeting with traveller and Roma communities. And I've been very struck by what I've seen. In Finglas the other day, I was taken in a halting site, to the back of a shed, and the door was opened, and there was exposed a marvelous traveller wagon, beautifully painted, beautifully preserved, and very self-consciously protected as an artistic expression of traveller identity, which, by the way, they use frequently, they told me, in terms of presenting themselves in schools and elsewhere. But have a look also at another piece, also a Roma piece. It's called Family, Garden of Dreams, executed in 2018 by the artist Ornella Rudavica. And she described this work as a celebration of family, but also of living, and I'm quoting, living traditions that are centuries old. One final, and my sixth context of engagement of the arts and human rights in this non-exhaustive list is the role of the artist in pointing to possible futures, different futures, futures in which human rights will have grown and developed to embrace new human realities. One such reality, of course, is the climate crisis. And again, Brian Maguire confronts us with this in some of his more recent work. Have a look at the clear-cut Amazon, also in display in one of the rooms. Again, here, a great painting. And I see within it those warnings and calls to action that are also present in Maragua land that I spoke to earlier. It's difficult to contemplate such paintings without realizing that we have to drastically change the way that we engage with our world. And moving to another artistic discipline, Kazuo Ishiguro, in his recent work Clara and the Sun, that I'm sure many of you have read, challenges us to think through the implications for human well-being of robotics, echoing issues that currently preoccupy human rights activists and regulators. Now, before proceeding any further, let me express some caveats, some calls for restraint in terms of the relationship of the arts and human rights, or at least reflections on possible limits to that relationship. And again, this is a non-exhaustive list. First, there is a danger that we instrumentalize the arts. There's a danger, certainly speaking from the human rights community side of things, that we take art and use it for our purposes. We objectify it in our own interests. This has to be avoided with great care. Any instrumentalization of art would be, I suggest, a destruction of that art. Its power is in its autonomy, and we must treat that autonomy with the greatest of respect. Secondly, and again directed to the human rights community, we have to avoid any form of colonization of the engagement of the arts with society, with humanity, with human well-being and thriving. Not everything is about human rights. Not everything is intended by the artist to be about human rights. There may often be an accidental correlation, and that's fine, but the artist must remain entirely entitled to articulate his or her vision for our world, individuals, for society, within the artist's own terms of reference, which may not be those of human rights actors. My third caveat has to do with the avoidance of excessive expectations from our collaboration. We should not expect that artistic expression is going to solve alone some great issues of the world. Art can and does repeatedly play a very important role, but no more than that. I think, for instance, of that very important moment of artistic expression of the playing of the cello by Vedran Smelovic in the destroyed library in Sarajevo back in 1992. That was a vivid moment which brought home the horrors of war to people all over the world. It plays its essential role in the narrative, in terms also of how we must respond to horror. But it, of course, in and of itself, did not and never could have stopped the war. Still another caveat is the recognition that art can actually do harm. I don't have time today to explore this in any great depth, but let me simply refer to inadvertent harm. Because there have been cases where artistic expression, intended, I suppose, to be a legitimate expression, was, rather than respectful of being human rights, something very different. I'll use an Irish example. It's an old one. A long time ago, 1980, the Rosk exhibition. I was in college here in Dublin. With a few of my pals, we came from our flat in Donnybrook because it was announced on one of the nights that the sculptor, so-called Martello Tower of Bread, was going to be dismantled and the bread would be given away to the public. So we came in for a lark. We thought, we'll get some free bread for the breakfast. But we were mortified when we got here. It was at Earlsford Terrace, in front of what's now the concert hall. We were mortified and embarrassed, and we slunk away because there were hundreds of hungry people there grabbing the bread, not for a lark like us, but because they needed the bread. And I look back on that moment as one of real shame and inappropriateness in terms of the exposure of these people to a public demonstration of the plight in which they found themselves. I have pictures from the day. I wasn't able to get my hands on them for tonight, but this one from the Irish Times I think does convey what I'm trying to describe. The last of my caveats in terms of the engagement of the arts and human rights has to do with the issue of access to the arts. To the extent that the arts are inaccessible, their engagement is so diminished in terms of its impact on any of all of us. Again, there are so many issues of access that we could explore, but let me start by saying how proud we should be here in Ireland that we have kept access to our great galleries and museums free of charge. This is something we're in danger of taking for granted, but it's so important. Just look at the damage that I think was done when the Metropolitan Museum in New York went from a donation-based entry system to a very expensive dollar price to gain admission. This is what you would pay tomorrow, $30 to gain admission if you're not from New York. One can only imagine the number of people that, as a result of this change of policy, have been excluded from engaging with the great art in that institution. But enough of the caveats. I don't want to give any impression that somehow the partnership of the artistic community and human rights should not be intensified. It has never been more needed than now. Let's just look around us. Look at our world and the extent to which human rights are being violated and are under extreme pressure. Because of the nature of my work, I see that, for instance, in the conflict in Ukraine, or rather the aggression against Ukraine, and in every dimension of it. Just a few days ago in Strasbourg, I met a group of mothers and wives of people abducted into Russian-controlled territory, and I can't begin to convey to you the pain or the suffering that I encountered in that meeting. I also think of the horrors in the Middle East, not just the dreadful conflict on the territories of the region, but also the impact of that conflict in terms of rising patterns of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred across Europe. I think of the situation of the communities I mentioned earlier, Roma and travelers, 12 million people across Europe pushed to the very edges of our societies. I think of the treatment of asylum seekers on so many borders put in very real danger. Never mind those we've spoken of already who drown in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. I think not only of the violation of human rights, but also the repudiation of the human rights system, of how it has become increasingly acceptable to say that if one doesn't like a human right, well, we'll disregard it. We'll disregard that treaty. We'll disregard that commitment. I think of the rhetoric associated with populism and the rise of the radical right. I even think of the extent to which it has become fashionable in our elite intellectual discourses to treat human rights as something past its sell-by date, something that could be replaced by something else. And remember what I said to you earlier, there is no plan B. There's no other universally agreed roadmap to honor human dignity. And so then, as I said, we have to intensify our engagement with each other in standing up for this remarkable achievement of modernity. Let me conclude with 3 specific suggestions, 3 specific areas for that collaboration. The first is that we need to strengthen our cooperation and partnership. We have to do it through the form of doing a better job of standing up for artistic practitioners, art practitioners themselves. I'm aware of the extent to which art practitioners come under different forms of pressure in different places, severe violations of their own human rights. This is Ai Weiwei's Remembering, an installation of 9,000 school backpacks that covered the Munich Haus der Kunst facade in 2009 to commemorate the pupils who died in 2008 after an earthquake devastated the Sichuan province in China. The sentence on the facade is from a victim's mother, and it reads, "All I want is to let the world remember that she had been living happily for 7 years." Following accusations from parents that substandard construction caused the collapse of the schools in the region, Ai Weiwei set upon a political investigation that would name every missing student and call the governments to account for the deaths. This investigation brought out the work Remembering and, according to the Guardian newspaper, changed his career forever. According to the paper, this is the artwork that made him the most dangerous person in China and sent him to jail. It's essential that we identify artists like Weiwei and we recognize them in the first place as human rights defenders, and then we find our ways to support them. This involves not only acts of solidarity, but also on the part of states offering humanitarian and respite visas to artistic practitioners who are under pressure where they come from. It means defending artists in the courtroom, giving them a voice in international human rights fora. It means accompanying them and developing tools as well as spaces to enhance their safety. Second, we have to create locations of encounter, more opportunities, more spaces within which the artistic and human rights communities can engage, get to know each other better, intermingle. It's in this context that I so very welcome any number of initiatives of recent years, including, dare I say, this very event this evening. Now, I've mentioned Musicians for Human Rights, but let me focus in this context just for a moment on another organization, Art for Human Rights. This wonderful organization was founded by Bill Shipsey from Dublin, originally for Amnesty International, and it plays an important role in bridging the divide to the betterment of our societies. Look at the attention drawn to that organization's donation in recent weeks to the University of Galway of a bust of Liu Xiaobao. This artwork, located in a public space in the university, will undoubtedly trigger necessary debate and reflection around issues of human rights. And third and final of 3 suggestions this evening has to do with investing in mutual literacy. Now, I'm not competent to speak to the extent to which an artistic practitioner could become more formally literate in the area of human rights. other than to suggest that it could be included in the curricula of art schools if it's not already there. But certainly, we in the human rights world need to become more literate regarding the breadth of artistic communities and the potential for engagement and cooperation in our shared goals. And this, of course, in turn, would include the value of including in the curricula of human rights programs, of which there are so many in the world today, of a deep appreciation of the diversity and the breadth of the arts and the potential for cooperation. But friends, you've heard enough from me. But before I conclude, I have to say that I'm well aware that I have not referred to a vast amount of relevant topics. If time had permitted, we should also have explored such issues as appropriation, colonialism, restitution. I would also have liked to plunge deeper into the relationship of art with individual and group identity. And I'm aware that my artistic references are predominantly Western. And frankly, that's simply a reflection of my own limited exposure to the art world. But to wrap up, let me come back to this exhibition and its title, La Grande Illusion. A deliberate reference, of course, to the 1937 film by Jean Renoir, a work neglected over many years despite its importance as a beacon of hope and encouragement. The film is highly complex, multi-layered, difficult to penetrate, but nevertheless there's a wide agreement that ultimately it is a powerful statement of how we can make a better world. The British Film Institute, in a recent review of a newly restored copy of the film, described La Grande Illusion as offering us a glimpse not of our destiny, but of a dream worth striving for. It said that while La Grande Illusion emphasizes a common humanity that transcends class, geography, and faith, it also argues that if we want a better world, it's not sentiment but effort that is required. And those words sum up pretty much everything that I wished to say this evening, and they describe, without a great doubt, the great work of Brian Maguire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for a wonderful talk this evening. Brian is going to join us up here. I'm Barbara Dawson, Director of the Gallery, and this is Michael Dempsey. We're co-curators of the exhibition. Brian, would you like to... We're sharing one mic. Is it between us all? They're mic'd up, are they? Okay. So, Brian, would you like to...
No.
How do we start?
I respond, I suppose, to Michael for his talk. Fantastic. The thing that struck me most is the caveats that you came about the relationship between art and human rights, and how we, the trap, I suppose, of many artists can fall into, blundering into an area that we don't know too much about, wanting to do good, but in fact have possibly the opposite effect. This is something that I was quite concerned with, I suppose, when we were putting this the show together, and because we have the power of the institution here as well, on top of the works of Brian Maguire, and to know that we're treading, the correct path, because many people have come to me and said, it's a beautiful show. Oh, can I say that? These paintings are beautiful. And, I suppose the response to that would be that, yes, the paintings are beautiful. Brian, you're a beautiful painter. The aesthetics is the aesthetic that brings us into the social. And so that idea of a balance possibly is required between that aesthetic and the social realm that brings you into it. And maybe, Brian, would you like to talk a little bit about how you walk that line?
I have it. Do you hear me? Yeah, I tried to break it earlier. No, thank you. That was a huge honour to listen to. I remember years ago, I was invited to take part in a show called Art in the English Garden, I think it was called. It was curated from Place de Vosges in Paris, a very grand space, and it was for Sarajevo. And I had a work which I had done following Srebrenica. And of course, I said, oh, this is great, send it off. It came back with thanks, but no thanks. We kind of know about this. We don't need you to tell us. You know, that's what, I think that fitted precisely what you were talking about. So it's what is appropriate. You know, on the other hand, in Juarez, the Native American you showed, the portrait, I had done that project in Juarez earlier, and eventually the portraits were shown in the museum in Juarez, and the people came into the centre, and I'll always remember one mother stood up and made a statement, and that was, she said, look, I was born on the periphery of this city. My daughter was born on the periphery of this city. My daughter was murdered on the periphery of this city. This is the first time I've ever been in the centre. And she said, and I'm very glad that my daughter is here in the centre and is being honoured. So making a picture is not a great thing. It doesn't stop wars, it doesn't bring anyone back, but it can be an acknowledgement. So the two examples I'm offering you are one where it was appropriate and one where it's not. But often you have to do it in order to find out. Yeah. You don't always know beforehand.
Would it be correct to say then that the painting is complete when it is actually represented in institutions?
Yeah,
Is it part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, people get mixed up perhaps people get mixed up about the role of the artist in all this. Our role is in the studio. We do research, but the fundamental thing is the studio. What happens after that involves lots of different people, you know, so yeah. Yourself included.
Just to go back to the concluding sentences of Michael, that, you know, what you want is feeling, not sentiment. And I think that it was a challenge. It's always a challenge to do a really great exhibition of a great artist, such as this exhibition by Brian. But I think that the material had that great depth of feeling that would certainly allowed us to start off rather than a certain amount of sentiment. And I think that's a great starting point. And also the beauty of the painting, the actual painting process is very obvious and very inherent. As we said before, the subject is the tough part, but you were talking about Brian's first painting that showed Maragua and that the hope in it. And I think that I would like to think, as a co-curator of this exhibition, that there is hope coming out of this exhibition as well, because otherwise it just lapses into sentimentality. And certainly Brian Maguire is not an artist of sentiment, he's an artist of feeling. What would you think, Michael?
I came in here on Sunday to look at the exhibition. I thought I can't talk about it without coming in and having a good look. I live abroad, so I just came home for the week. But I went to the end room. For those of you who've been here, you'll know what I'm referring to. And it really challenged me. It left me very confused, the last room, because it's so difficult down there. I had to cope with so many contradictions. How can such horror be depicted with such beauty? Can I call it beauty? But yet, I was only looking at it because it's beautiful. It was through the medium of the beauty, the painterly beauty, that the horrors are depicted. That was my first crisis. My second crisis, all in one room down at the back here, was how can I talk about art as hope in that room? The sense of hope drained away from me down there. And I left confused, and I marched down O'Connell Street in a bit of a bind, because this notion of hope at the centre was central to my thesis. The whole thing was going to unravel 2 days before the talk. But I came to my own conclusion. I have no idea, Brian, if it's yours, but it's the one that brought me peace and reconciled me, which was the hope isn't the very fact that you created the depiction.
Exactly.
You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't bother your time painting it if you didn't feel that the world could be better, and that we could learn from this not to do it again. And so it was just in the fact of the art that I found the hope, not necessarily transmitted through the image and the application of the paint.
Yeah. I'd like to agree with you. I'll tell you a story about the source of the single images, the small images, were in the cameras of the men who go out on Saturday night to photograph whatever violence occurs in Juarez in 2010. I think it was the most dangerous city in the world then. But the newspaper didn't use them. I had access to newspapers' files. These photos were not in the files. The cameramen had them, and they said, look, here, use these. The other one, the big massacre from Laredo, it had occurred, outside Laredo. Somebody had photographed what the Zetas had left, sent it to the Houston Chronicle, who couldn't cope with it. They sent it to the Guardian, who couldn't cope with it. And Ed Villamy sent it to me, saying, maybe you can do something with this. The idea of such a thing disappearing from the world, having been done, was enough to get me started. The point you make about, I used to call that picture God is the absence of God, or there's no God here, but the aesthetics of making it, the painting business is you somehow or other, I'm not confused with the Zetas that this painting is furthering their aims. Nobody thinks that, so it's something else. And I like to think that the act of doing this work is a final respect for the dead, that they're not allowed to disappear in the social world without some acknowledgement.
May I suggest, Brian, that it's an act of remembering as to what gets represented. The fact that these paintings end up in the archives of museum collections, and unlike a news story or an Instagram, that we all see quite a lot of horrific images through our phones these days. So the idea of photography, which is instant and temporal, as opposed to a painting which is preserved in a national collection and can be brought out and remembered. And these individuals' lives, each human life is remembered, and that's kind of part of the power of the work.
Yeah, I often think of I think of all the people in the world, half of them have a mobile phone that takes pictures. And would they have 500 each? Pictures are made on the phone. It's a huge amount of images. No wonder we can't find anything.
Certainly the notion of these paintings, in one way history paintings, which they will become, can't be erased. They can't be wiped. They can't be folded away, or they can't be thrown in the bin. As you say, they're not temporary. They're very much permanent. Could we throw this discussion out to the floor and see, would anybody like to ask questions of Michael or Brian, or other Michael or me? Just 1 second, we'll give you a mic, it's coming to you now.
Could I ask Mr. Maguire how he goes about his work? Is he politically moved and comes up with a construct and then starts working and it evolves? Or does he have an idea before he starts? It's very beautiful work.
Could you just repeat that for us?
Yeah, it's okay. I got it. How do I start?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. No bother. It could start many different ways. The Native American or the Juarez work started by reading a book about what was happening, and I got very, very angry. I saw all my kind of interests in life, class, gender, race, coming together into one story. I said, geez, I better go and do something, because it seemed to suit me. And so I did. Others, I was asked to go to the Maraguaya lands in the Amazon. There was a Dubliner asked me, Pat Clark, a priest in São Paulo. But in all cases, I generally start off angry. I don't think there's anything there that I didn't. I mean, Aleppo is one of the oldest cities in the world. I have a studio in another city, and at the end of the road, they were selling soap from Aleppo, which was guaranteed by my mate. It says, it'll do your skin no harm. It's very important to a man like me. But anyway, it was 3,000 years old, the method of making the soap. And it was made from, what was the olive oil, yeah. And what the Roman emperors wear on their head? Laurel, yeah, that's it. They'd mixture these two pieces of vegetation, produced this soap, and it was for sale in a Coptic Christian grocery. And it was just so unusual. The city was Paris, the heart of all that business of, soap. So I got interested in Aleppo because of that, then found out it was one of the oldest, 7,000 years old. And then it was wrecked by munitions and by fascism of all different kinds.
Could I just jump in on something you said? You said that your art starts with anger, and that's, if I was asked when the best human rights advocacy starts, where it comes from, it's anger. It's exactly the same thing. You're no good at human rights if you don't get angry. If you deal with it just as a job or a bureaucratic task, useless waste of time. And you can only get angry, by the way, when you immerse yourself in the reality as best you can.
Yeah. So it's the passion. It's the anger is the beginning, and then there is the compassion in the work. There's an anger that starts in, but there's also quite a lot of compassion in Brian's work. And in this exhibition, we also talk about Brian understanding anger at the circumstances and the conditions that create both the perpetrators as well as the victims. And I think that's where the greatness, for want of a better word, comes, because that's what we're about. Why does this happen? It's not. It's moving from black and white into total colour, technicolor, actually.
I just want to say that I was blessed by a kind of a misunderstanding in the Arts Council as to my politics. They thought I was a provo, and they asked me to go into Portlaoise prison many years ago. I don't know, 30 years ago or something. I spent 15 years in them, and I went to every prison in Ireland, and I was completely blessed by this interaction. So I began to understand there were two sides to every story. And you mightn't like the other side, but it's there. It needs to be listened to.
Yeah. Well, that's the only way forward, isn't it, Michael? If you have the whole story as much as you can, You can't just beat down one side in order to bring up the other side.
The job is fixing problems, not just denouncing abuses. And for that, you need a full, comprehensive understanding. There are bad people who do bad things, and there's no denying that. And people have to be held account. But there's normally a whole range of complex things going on in any situation which require you to navigate your way somehow down the center of the story, or else you won't bring about the change that you're seeking. Take the situation of the travelling community in this country, which is absolutely dreadful. But working with travellers to fix these problems is very, very difficult, because there are you speak with the travelling community, and you'll hear a diversity of voices, of course, but you'll hear a certain perspective. Then you'll go into official Ireland, and you'll hear something very different. And there's a bit of truth in both. And the solution is in finding that common ground and working on that.
The common ground. Have we any other questions? Yes, over here. And after after that. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael, for your talk. I was struck by when you put up the painting of Guernica, which I think Picasso's inspiration for that, as far as I'm aware, was his anger over the German bombing of the city of Guernica. But what strikes me about that painting is that could be Gaza. So you didn't mention Gaza, but I assume that you're angry about Gaza. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I did mention it. I deliberately used the term the territories of the region, because it's not just Gaza. This contagion of conflict is spreading into numerous places now, and I didn't have the time to, and tonight isn't specifically about that. But I'm as outraged and horrified as anybody else. I'm outraged about the use of weaponry against civilians. I'm outraged about the impact of that conflict here in Europe. There are very many dimensions. In the job I have at the Council of Europe, I have a mandate limitation to look at what goes on inside the Council of Europe. And that's why if you're asking me why I'm not more vocal in general around the issue, it's because of the geographic limits to the mandate I currently hold.
Now, this man here way in the front is next, and then the person behind, the lady behind. Note this here.
Thank you again, Brian. One of the things, when I came into this exhibition 2 days ago, I looked at the screen and listened to you talking about your life story. And one of the things that struck me is about the prisons, that when they had a problem there, the last person to come to is an artist. Would you like to say something about that?
Do I mention that?
You do, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there was there are very poor psychological services, not in terms of the individuals, but there's hardly any of them. You know, like there's so many prisoners and there's so few psychologists or psychiatrists available. But there was one man I knew I had worked with, and he was, I don't know, he was himself. But the department wrote to me and said, I call him John, that John has stopped to talk to anyone. He's refusing to talk to anybody they send to him. And he has nothing but bad words. I'm paraphrasing, they didn't write like that. Nothing but bad words for everybody, except he talks well of you. Would you be willing to go see him? Of course I was. And this is a man I'd worked with who had taken his work, and I could see where he was going. He was going to end up back in the circumstances which caused him the violence to occur and to be arrested. And just before he got there, he blew, and he didn't do that work. And I'm not in charge of him. I'm a teacher of painting. You know, I give him the gear to make the work. That's about all I do. But, so I wasn't going to stop him, you know. And sure enough, at the end, he had some respect for me somewhere. I think it was because I didn't stop him. He stopped himself in the end. That's what's behind that remark. He's now out. He's no longer in prison. And he's living his life. I don't have any contact with him, unlike others. You know.
My question is for Michael, and during your talk I was thinking of a man imprisoned in Turkey called Osman Kavala, who is a protector generally of classical sites. And I was wondering, how do you maintain optimism when institutions like the Council of Europe, they're so disregarded by countries like Turkey, who then go on to imprison their citizens who are also act as cultural defenders? I'm wondering how you maintain that optimism to keep going.
Yeah. Let me take the Kavala case specifically first. I'm not going to give up on the Kavala case, of course. The European Court of Human Rights twice has ordered that Kavala be released, and it's my job to advocate for implementation of that judgment, and I'll continue to do that for him and for others in similar situations. So you have my assurance on that. Where do I find the hope? I find the hope in the fact that I've been in this work my whole life, and I've seen enough improvement, enough change to consider that it's worth the effort. We're in a terrible moment right now, but we made such progress in recent decades, so much progress in so many different ways, and we are having a backsliding now, but that's not a moment to give up. It's a moment to recognize the importance of the moment and to invest even more than ever in trying to ensure that the future will be a better and different place. I'm also struck by, I can't quote him, I'm useless at that, but I can paraphrase him, what's his name, Václav Havel, who said, hope is not an emotion, it's a duty. And that's now a bad paraphrase, but it's the essence, and it keeps me going.
Any more questions, observations for the panel? Any observations, final observations, Brian, for this evening?
No, just to say thank you for coming.
I have one more. I'll give her one. It's a remark that Brian used, that wonderful video, which I recommend everyone to have a look at. 14 minutes, well worth spending in front of the monitor. But Brian, you said, you were talking about a comment that someone came to you on how significant were artists. And you said, they don't realise how insignificant an artist is. You know, why be an artist? And I often, meditate on that role of the artist in society. And I suppose it's here in a cultural institution, with, I would imagine, mostly a cultural community, we talk to ourselves a lot. And so it's a question really to Michael in regards to, how significant, or is there any real effect that a cultural institution, that an artist plus a cultural institution can have upon real politics? Or are we, literally in our own cultural bubble? Does it have an effect on the world?
First, there's way more effect than impact on politics. Brian had already spoken to the empowering role of art, the painting of these people, and how they felt honoured and dignified. The story he told just now, the lady coming into the middle of the city, that in itself is enough importance to justify it, even if there wasn't a single other thing. There is the capacity of art is a primary vehicle for remembering. You said this, you reminded us of this, the role of the gallery, the role of the museum in what the future will understand about the past is absolutely central, and it's not peripheral. as both as a raconteur of the past and as an echo of the problems and the issues of the past, but that's transmitted through art. So that's also in and of itself so important that it's enough of a justification. But I see art, I do see art impacting popular and social movements in a way which in turn then impacts politics because of the power of art to transmit a message. When Sinead O'Connor would sing about a human rights issue, or Bono or whoever else, so many more people listen and get the point than would ever get it through a speech or a report by somebody like me. And then in turn, those social movements, and we've seen in recent years how powerful social movements have been, for good and for ill indeed, in shaping our politics. And right there in the immediacy of the decision-making room, the reason I used the Guernica image, it was the tapestry from New York, was because diplomats will tell you that that for all their failure, that painting, that tapestry challenges them and leaves them feeling that they have to do better. And I know nobody's ever measured this. There's this interesting study for whatever discipline would do this. But already that's something I think significant and worthy. That's why I think the great institutions that decide our fate invest so heavily in art. Some of the less appreciated and often really impressive collections around the world are in parliaments and in the intergovernmental organizations. And I think that's quite deliberate.
One more question down there. Last question of the evening.
It's a comment and maybe provoke a response, because say that now I am feeling my blood boil and my cheeks are red, so whether that's anger or passion or the permission you've given once you feel anger or passion, say something, so there you go. I suppose I'm struck by your comment there around hope, and there's a woman who's in my mind quite a bit at the moment, because there's a book written recently. It's around the Irish in the resistance in Europe during World War II. Now, one of the women, I happen to know her story for many years.
Can you speak a bit more slowly? It's a bit hard to hear you.
Yeah, no, I'm saying there's a book written recently, some of you will be familiar with it. It's about the Irish in the resistance in Europe in World War II. Now, one of the women, I've known her story for many years, so this question has come up for me around hope. I've worked in human rights and equality really over decades, but she's actually my grandaunt, and she became part of it. She was an Irish nun from Cork, who at 18 went to France. The stories, goes on, but the crux of it basically is that she joined the French resistance. She was caught, she was sentenced to death as a special enemy of the Nazi state. She was in solitude for 1 year in a male prison. She went through 5 concentration camps, etc., became out alive. Now, I looked at her story there with an artist friend of mine actually years ago, and the crux of it was, I said, look, she would risk her life. I make speeches, so where is the difference? And that was the piece. For me, there's a difference personally to explore. But she's also kind of provoked me to think the difference between brave and courage. We say people are brave, but actually many of us face awful things, people in Aleppo and other places in our life, that we don't have a choice about. I think she was brave and she was courageous because she had a choice. So I admire her for that. But then if I bring it back to the individual level and to my level, I do have a choice on some issues to actually stand up and be counted. And then others, because I'm a woman or other reasons, I don't feel I have a choice. I have to speak up. I don't have that choice, and many people don't. And I suppose ultimately, whether it's hope or it's courage, I think it comes down to choice. And if you have a choice, you have an obligation to do something today, say something, whatever the impact may or may not be, because someday, if you don't, you too won't have a choice. And I suppose that's it, to hope, to courage, choice. It's a comment from me, but I'd love if there was a response. Thank you.
It's a good ending.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it is a very good ending, Michael. Thank you very much to you all for coming this evening, and thank you so much to Michael for attending this evening, as he's based in Brussels. I really appreciate you coming over. I hope we'll see you again, and as always, thank you to Brian for giving us this superb exhibition. Thank you.
Thanks to you.